This briefing focuses on Vietnam. The goal of this presentation is to inform you on the various aspects of that country in preparation for your upcoming investment decision. There are many aspects of a country that may be relevant to potential investment decisions, and the various languages of a country is the first of such issues. Similarities and differences in languages can have a substantial impact on a firm's ability to communicate with local customers, suppliers, and even employees. As most people in Brazil would be aware, the dominant language in Vietnam is Vietnamese, although its vocabulary borrows heavily from Chinese, especially for words that denote abstract ideas. Indeed, in contrast to Portuguese, it will be difficult to find two languages that are further apart than Portuguese and Vietnamese. However, it is also true that there is a language reasonably common to both countries, English. While it has not reached similar levels to Brazil, the use of English in Vietnam is growing rapidly. A second issue which can influence a firm's ability to conduct business in a foreign country is the dominant religion. Religion has a potentially powerful impact on people's value systems and can influence how they behave and interact with one another. In contrast to Brazil, between 50 and 80% of the Vietnamese population claims an affiliation with Mahayana Buddhism, leaving Christianity as a minority religion at 7% of the population. However, while Brazil and Vietnam differ in terms of their dominant religions, they are remarkably similar in terms of their tolerance for and diversity of minority religions within each country. Indeed, the constitutions of both countries formally guarantee freedom of religion. A third factor which may influence a company's ability to conduct business in a foreign country is the level of industrial development. This not only influences the cost of labor in a country and the consumption patterns, but it also arguably shapes the attitudes, values, and behaviors of the population in general. In terms of the level of economic and industrial development, Brazil and Vietnam both fall well behind the OECD countries, but are rapidly closing the gap in terms of their GDP per capita, the prominence of the service sector, the per capita consumption of energy, and the ownership of consumer goods such as televisions and telephones. However, despite these obvious similarities, there are also substantial differences between Brazil and Vietnam. Most notably among these differences are Brazil's GDP per capita, which is more than triple Vietnam's, and the much higher level of ownership of consumer items such as motor vehicles. A fourth important issue is the similarities and or differences in the educational systems of countries. In Vietnam, as in Brazil, the country still faces many difficulties regarding adequate teaching materials, infrastructure, and teacher qualifications. In both countries, millions of children are still unable to achieve an adequate education. However, in contrast to Brazil, in Vietnam, education is only free and compulsory at primary school ages 6 to 11, and after grade 6, parents have to pay for school. Nevertheless, it's noteworthy that Vietnam's literacy rate, at 92%, is higher than Brazil's. A fifth critical issue with respect to doing business in another country is similarities and or differences in the legal and political systems. The Communist Party-controlled government of Vietnam is ruled under a state constitution to provide it with a democratic appearance. There is a strong executive branch and a relatively weak National Assembly that only meets twice a year. While some reforms have happened, the country is still fundamentally undemocratic. However, while it is true the political and legal systems are very different between Vietnam and Brazil, both countries' constitutions have provisions for human rights, and these constitutions serve as a source of law. Interestingly, the Vietnamese legal system shares another common attribute with Brazil, in that they have a common origin in the French legal system. A sixth, but potentially more subtle issue, is similarities and or differences in actual business practices. This can involve simple but potentially embarrassing issues, such as how to properly greet people and attitudes towards time. There are many differences between Vietnamese and Brazilian business practices. For example, the Vietnamese business people are indirect in their communication, and much meaning is passed through body language instead of words. Vietnamese will avoid using no in answering questions. They will tend to say maybe, or that would be difficult, or even yes, even if the answer is really no. However, there are more similarities between Brazil and Vietnam than many people assume. Business in Vietnam, as in Brazil, is based on personal relationships. You may have to make several trips to Vietnam to achieve your objectives, and Vietnamese business people prefer to establish a strong relationship before closing a deal. The seventh and final issue is the broader set of cultural values which are commonly shared by a large portion of a country's population. Countries can vary in terms of the emphasis placed on individuality versus conformity, the attitudes towards uncertainty and ambiguity, the attitudes towards authority and social inequities, and not the least, attitudes towards how gender roles are allocated in society. Brazil and Vietnam have very different cultures in many aspects. Brazilians are less liberal in terms of gender roles, as they are more masculine than Vietnamese. There is also a large difference in terms of the comfort with ambiguity. Vietnamese tend to be far more at ease when faced with uncertainty than Brazilians are. Nevertheless, both countries are collectivist and are concerned more with the group than the individual. Similarly, in both countries there is a strong respect for authority, and hierarchy is important. This concludes our brief presentation on Vietnam.